Dr. Scott Bonn, welcome to Shrink Wrap Radio.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, well, I'm really glad to have you. We're going to be discussing your work as a criminologist and your book, Why We Love Serial Killers. So, first of all, I have to congratulate you on writing such a readable, comprehensive, and authoritative book.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. It's a book that I really envisioned being for people who want to get an overview of serial killers, what they do. But this is not a practitioner's book. This is not a practicum. This is not for FBI agents or something like that.
Right.
It's for the general public, but it's to get really inside of the minds of these individuals to try to understand their drives, their fantasies, their needs. But then what I also like to do, and why it's called Why We Love Serial Killers, that's the title of the book, and which I realize is an ironic title, is I sort of turn the mirror around so that we look at ourselves psychologically and say, what is the incredible fascination with these individuals? So that's a big part of what the book is about as well.
That's maybe a good place for us to start here is how do you answer that question for yourself?
Well, through extensive research and also participating in a live show that I do, a theatrical show that I do around the United States, I have learned an awful lot about the true crime audience. And your audience may be interested to know that the true crime audience, which consists of millions and millions of people, is predominantly female in composition. 80 to 90% women are drawn to this. Now, it doesn't mean that there aren't men who are interested in serial killers and true crime, but it really is a female thing. And I have investigated this. I've talked to a lot of
Yeah.
female true crime fans. And what they tell me, or my interpretation, is that it has to do with empathy. I think we as human beings empathize with all things, the good and the bad. Which is why I think that many of us will actually empathize with and identify with the villain or the monster in classic monster movies. You know, we'll identify with the plight of King Kong or Dracula or the Frankenstein monster
Yeah.
and try
Yeah.
to understand, from their perspective. And I think the same is true with serial killers. The women tell me that they, of course, identify with the victims in these stories because they are predominantly women. So there, but for the grace of God, go I, so to speak. But then there's also the need to try to understand the mind of the predator so as to arm themselves and not become victim of these individuals, or perhaps date or get involved or marry the next Ted Bundy or John Wayne Gacy. So they tell me they're looking for tools. They're looking for practical tools, which is why they are drawn to these, true crime shows, podcasts, etc., and why they frankly come to my show as well. But there's, you dig in deeper and you dig into the psychology of this, and I think your audience may find this perspective interesting. This one of my conclusions is that when something is so horrific, so horrible, so incomprehensible as why Jeffrey Dahmer would apprehend, kill, mutilate, and ultimately eat his victims, it's beyond the ken, it's beyond our understanding, and therefore truly terrifying. And I think almost at a subconscious level, we think that if I can just somehow wrap my mind around it, then maybe it's not so terrifying after all. I can sleep better at night. But I talked about turning the mirror, to ourselves. And I think the serial killer also allows us to do that or begs us to do that. We might say, I hate my boss. I hate that SOB. I could kill him, but we don't really do it. We think about it, but we don't really do it. These individuals do. So it begs us to sort of look into the mirror, the darkest part of our nature and our predispositions, and say, what might I do under the most stressful circumstances? Could I ever be compelled to do something like this? It
Well,
stretches our.
yeah, that begs the question of whether or not we're all potentially killers. What do you think about that? Maybe not serial killers, but if the circumstances of our lives were different, I'm not sure how influential you think the background is, the person's socioeconomic background, et cetera, is. But
Yes.
so,
Well,
so do you think
it's a great.
if we grew up otherwise than we did, might might we all have that capability within us?
Well, there is the the survival instinct, and so I think within each and every one of us there is that need for survival, and driven to extremes. What might we do if we were compelled to kill? If a gun was put to our head, or if a gun was put to a loved one's head, what might we do? Some of you, I'm sure you're familiar, and many of your audience are familiar with the Stanley Milgram experiments. Where people were led to believe that they were shocking other people to the point that they might kill them in a so-called learning experience. And 2/3 of the people were actually motivated by simply an authoritarian figure saying, you should do this, you need to do this. 2/3 shocked other people to the point that they thought they might have deeply hurt them or killed them. So yes, I think under those circumstances, but you bring up the great nature versus nurture debate. And when it comes to serial killers, really both apply. And I'll explain what I mean. Most serial killers, the vast majority, are either psychopaths or sociopaths. And as I'm sure you well know, that the American Psychiatric Association, excuse me, considers them to be antisocial personality disorders for which there is no cure, which is to distinguish them from something like schizophrenia, paranoid schizophrenia, that is truly a clinical condition and can be treated. So if you've got these individuals who are psychopaths and sociopaths, they simply don't have the normal range of empathetic feelings and connection to another living person, particularly the psychopaths. And I am of the camp that believe that psychopaths are born differently. Their brain simply is wired differently and responds differently to stimuli, and has very low impulse control, in the frontal lobe of the brain, which allows them to do these things with impunity. So if you combine low impulse control with the need to dominate others, and a lack of remorse, sadness, fear, etc., then you have almost like a perfect cold-blooded killing machine. Sociopaths, differently. Here's where the environmental conditions come in. And a great example here is the female serial killer, Eileen Wuornos, that some of your audience may be familiar with. There was a movie called Monster. Charlene Theron starred in that. She did an incredible job. Here's an individual who I believe was born with a normal brain, so to speak, but she, through years and years of abuse and trauma and torture, became conditioned into becoming a retaliatory and predatory individual herself, and ultimately began killing. She was a prostitute, and she worked along the highway getting in clients' cars, and she ultimately started killing them because in her mind, she was striking back at her oppressor, who had harmed her. So there's a classic example of an individual who really got conditioned into it. And of course, not all psychopaths are serial killers, and not all serial killers are psychopaths. But what seems to happen for those who have this genetic predisposition in the brain, right around the age of puberty, something happens where the sexual impulse and drive gets twisted and confounded with harming people and torture and sadism, and they become sexually aroused by doing these things, which is why some of these individuals, like Ted Bundy and Dennis Rader, BTK, and others, harm animals. And Jeffrey Dahmer actually brought roadkill home, and he would become sexually aroused by putting his hands in the body cavities of dead animals. So clearly, there's a major red flag if you've got a child or an adolescent who does those sorts of things. And this follows a progression. This becomes a fantasy loop in these individuals' minds, and they often combine it in adolescence and early adulthood with masturbation. So violence, shocking sadism, and images of violence and fantasies combined with masturbation becomes a compulsion with them. And they reach what I call a tipping point where they can no longer live in their own minds and they have to actually live it in reality and kill.
Yeah,
And then
yeah,
once that
act out.
happens, the
Right.
train's left the station at that point.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you're covering a lot of ground here very quickly, and I appreciate that. I wanted to back up to something that I was wondering about because you and I, in a previous brief phone conversation, I was surprised to discover that you were not aware um, what a perfect host I would be to interview you, given that I um, co-authored a book on the Zodiac serial killer in 2001. But you didn't know that. What drew you to this show? You approached me wanting to be interviewed. Um, how
It
did
was
that
kismet.
happen?
It was just kismet. I checked. I was listening to some, your show. I did not know that, but I just said to myself, this just seems like a perfect fit to talk about what I do. And so I guess it was destiny or fate that we were supposed to connect, and I'm so happy that we did.
Yeah, I'm kind of a big believer in synchronicity, and so
Me
for me,
too.
this fits into kind of a synchronistic pattern uh, that's happened. But I don't want to get away too far from your book here. Um, so I'm just looking at some of the questions I planned to ask you, and you've already gotten into them. Um, let's talk about the myths that surround serial killers. I mean, there
Yes.
are, uh, and I wanted to pick up on your observation about women being and dominating the, and something that I've noticed is I like to read not serial killer novels, but murder mystery type novels,
Hmm.
and so many of them now, there's a huge influx of women authors.
Hmm. Hmm.
And that's what I'm finding. And um, so I think maybe those two things are related. But let's
I
talk
think you're
about
right. I think you're
yeah,
absolutely right.
yeah, let's talk about the myths that you can dispel here that surround
Sure.
serial killers.
Yeah, I like to call the depiction of serial killers in the media, in news media, as well as the entertainment media, fictionalized films and things like that. They serial killers are almost given like a larger than life. What I call celebrity monster status.
Yeah.
They're sensationalized and dramatized. There's probably no better example of that than Jeffrey Dahmer, who has become just iconic. I mean, believe it or not, there are Jeffrey Dahmer cookbooks and recipe books,
Oh my
which,
goodness.
which I think is in pretty bad taste, but
Yeah.
nevertheless, see how he's become part of the culture. And in terms of the mythology, the idea, if you ask the average person, they're going to tell you that the average serial killer is a fairly young white male who's kind of awkward and weird and lives by himself out in the woods,
Yeah.
and is somewhat dysfunctional, and the of course the iconic fictional character there is like the Tooth Fairy in the Silence of the Lambs films. Also, Buffalo Bill fall into those category, and there are serial killers like that, but that is by no means the norm. I mean, you have serial killers like I believe Rex Heuermann, who was recently arrested for the Long Island serial killer murders, and another one like Dennis Rader, who called himself Bind, Torture, Kill. These were family men. These are middle aged family men who raised beautiful families, who had wonderful wives, who were in many ways the pillar of their community. Dennis Rader, BTK, was the president of his Lutheran Church Association. Ironically, he was the Boy Scout leader in town, and yet he was a sadistic killer. Bind, torture, kill is what he did to his victims. And Rex Heuermann was an architect, a highly successful architect with his own business and a family as well. So the myth that they're these sort of strange loners, is just not true. And the fact that they're all white males is not true. There are female serial killers. We mentioned Eileen Wuornos. There are serial killers of every race, of every ethnic group, religious following, sexual orientation. They're very varied. But the ones that we tend to know the most about, the ones that become almost iconic, are the ones that typically kill young white women. They're the ones that make it in the headlines. And there's a phenomenon that some of your audience may be familiar with. Is called missing white woman syndrome. Although white women make up less than 25% of all the people who go missing every year, they are virtually 100% of the stories when missing person stories hit the news. So it's simply when there's a female white victim, we as a society and the news media takes it very, very seriously. So the news and entertainment media help to perpetuate some of these stereotypes that it's all, these white males. And there of course are other myths as well. I can go into some more if you'd like.
Actually, what you've said so far raises the question about profiling.
Yes.
The concept of profiling, and actually the book that I wrote, I was brought into the project to try to profile the Zodiac. Um, and, just, and I did it from a sort of as a depth psychologist, kind of coming from that point of view. But what is the basis for thinking that we could profile, given the insane variety that you just described?
Right.
It seems like it would be a hopeless task to try to profile.
It's a wonderful question, and I'm going to answer that by telling you a story. I was very involved with the Long Island serial killer case, and back in 2010, when the first bodies were discovered on the south shore of Long Island, Gilgo Beach, and they were four petite sex workers who were discovered there on the beach. Law enforcement knew they had a serial killer on their hands, and it became a big story. And at that time, in 2010, I was teaching at Drew University, which is a university just east of New York City in New Jersey. And I had been working with the news media quite a bit, providing commentary on different stories. And they asked me to profile the Long Island serial killer, this unknown perpetrator, based upon what they knew from the crime scene. Now, the FBI and a specific individual, his name was Roy Hazelwood. He was one of what I like to call the OG profilers from the 1970s. along with John Douglas and Bob Ressler, who may be more familiar to your audience. But Roy Hazelwood was truly a visionary genius. And he came up with the theory, which has proven to be quite accurate, that you can profile the psychology, even the behaviors and demographics of a serial killer by looking at all of the crime scene evidence, the way that they leave their victims, the nature of the crime scene, and these crime scenes tend to be repeated. The serial nature of it. Sometimes there are what are known as signatures, where they repeat the same behavior and leave the same
Yeah.
evidence scene after scene, and you can identify and predict what these individuals will be like and their next moves by going backwards, working retroactively, and matching it to solved cases like the Green River Killer and Ted Bundy and BTK, etc. And this is exactly what I did. I was also trained in criminalistics and crime scene analysis, but I utilized this approach. And what I came up with as a profile for the Long Island serial killer is that he would be very much of a BTK type of character. He would be a psychopathic sexual narcissist, torturer, sexual sadist. He'd be a middle aged white man. He would be married with adult children. He would be very meticulous and organized, like his crime scenes. He would be persuasive in nature, the ability to convince these young sex workers to do what he wanted and go with him wherever he so fit. He would be physically strong. And most importantly, he would live in the immediate vicinity of his sacred burial ground on Gilgo Beach, which is where I believe that he would return and anytime he needed to relive and fantasize about those kills. So now 12 years goes by. My profile was published in the New York Times back in 2011. It received quite a bit of news attention at the time. But 12 years went by, and then last summer, my phone began to ring off the hook in July. And it was news media from all over the country and all over the world saying Rex Heuermann had just been arrested and charged with these murders, and that my profile was dead on. And so within the next
Wow.
few weeks, within the next few weeks, I was, you named it,
Yeah.
the news outlet. I was on there, and as I got familiar with Rex Heuermann, it was uncanny. Even more than I could have ever anticipated how right on my profile was. Because not only was he the middle aged white man, the family man, he was trained as an architect, trained in mathematics and engineering and design. Who is more meticulous and organized than an architect? Who is more persuasive than an architect who had to sell his own ideas and also then use those same skills to manipulate and coerce these young sex workers? And you talk about power and control. He's a power and control dominating killer, giant of a man, 6'6", almost 300 pounds. And he was killing petite sex workers, some of whom were not even 5 feet tall. And he was a hunter, a bear hunter. He gutted animals. And the ultimate is he lived a stone's throw, viewing distance to his burial ground on
Wow.
Lido
Yeah.
Beach.
Wow. You really did nail it. Now, to put the two things together, that profiling was possible, and what you said about the wide variety, I would think that we could conclude that profiling makes sense for individual cases and you're looking at the track record and so on. Uh, but you can't necessarily generalize to all serial killers.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. But every serial killer has a different crime scene. They leave different evidence, and based upon that evidence, you can draw conclusions. I knew by the way this guy left his crime scenes that we were dealing with what's known as a power and control killer, highly organized and highly meticulous. The absolute opposite. There's what's known as a disorganized crime scene, and that is where they will normally leave the victim. There will be no attempt to try to hide the victim at all. They just blitz the individual and leave them where they are. The classic example of that is, of course, Jack the Ripper, who just slashed women to shreds in London and left them in a pile of gore on the street. That type of individual is usually an unsophisticated, low intellect, true madman from a clinical, from a clinical standpoint. It's a very different individual, which is why if I was profiling back in those days, I would have never have thought it would have been a medical doctor, because the individual who did this demonstrated no medical knowledge whatsoever. He just hacked them to pieces. A butcher has more medical forensic knowledge, or the human anatomy. So what I would say in conclusion, I mean, about profiling, is what it really allows us to do is to eliminate people. It won't say that Rex Heuermann is the man in and of itself. You need evidence and you need DNA and things like that to identify him, but it narrows it down that he is a likely suspect, and it will eliminate a lot of other people.
Yeah, yeah. Um, I'm aware that we haven't really gone over your credentials, and it's clear that you have training in this area and in psychology. So just say a little bit about how you get to be who you are.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I have a master's degree in criminal justice, so I take that. I have the sort of the practicum experience, but more importantly, my PhD is in criminology. So I am more theoretical and looking at patterns and getting inside the minds of these individuals. I'm not an FBI agent. I don't carry a gun. Those sorts of things. And I was a college professor, tenured professor for about 15 years. I'm now an independent consultant and producer. As I said, I produce my own live show that I take around the country and educate people, and hopefully provide some entertainment value about these things. But the first 20 years of my professional career was completely different. I was in the advertising, media, and communications world. I was actually a vice president at NBC Television Network during the Seinfeld years. And how these two things are linked is that I began to see that the old journalistic adage really, really applies, which is if it bleeds, it leads. The more sensationalized it is, the more gory it is, the more people who tune in, and thereby more advertising is sold based upon the size of the audience. And that's where I began to see that certain people like Charles Manson, like the son of Sam, BTK, Jeffrey Dahmer, become these larger than life ghouls almost in our popular culture, and we're drawn to them. So my background in media combined with my training in criminology got me focusing on how these individuals have just almost become larger than life.
And I have the impression that you also have credentials in sociology.
Yeah, well, criminology is a specialty within sociology.
Okay.
So I look at things very sociologically, the patterns of society. And that's why I'm so interested in the way society reacts to serial killers and perceives serial killers, because I have that sociological training. If you talk to the average person and you say to them, based upon your general knowledge, what portion of all homicides or what percent of all homicides are committed by serial killers? And I've heard 25%, I've heard 50%. Reality is less than 1%. But because of the stage, if you will, or the platform that we put these individuals on in movies, TV shows, podcasts, books, paraphernalia, cookbooks, like I was telling you about, the,
Yeah.
the perception is that they are much bigger, grandiose, and prolific than they really are.
Yeah. Yeah. So what do you think? Do you think that is partially a cause of serial killers? I mean, do you think that is that a driving force for some people to tip them over the edge and say, "Hey, I want to be famous." I'm thinking of the guy who killed John Lennon, for example.
Yeah, yeah. Well, of course, he's not a serial killer, but there are serial killers who are what I call students of the game, meaning that they follow each other. And in some cases, they're even jealous of one another. Um,
Uh,
I got to know David Berkowitz, the son of Sam, very well. I spent a day with him, an entire day with him in maximum security prison one day, interviewing him and having lunch with him, and as well as BTK and some others, like I said, Long Island serial killer. And I found, for example, that BTK, Dennis Rader, who grew up in Wichita and was killing at the same time in Wichita that the son of Sam, David Berkowitz, was killing in New York City, was actually jealous of the media attention that Berkowitz got. He was in a bigger media market. He was in New York City. He was getting global media attention, whereas BTK was not. And he was actually jealous of that. He told me that, in fact. So if he had been in New York or Chicago or Los Angeles, more people would probably be familiar with BTK. Although, I mean, he is a pretty infamous individual, but for his concerns, he didn't get enough media attention. The incredible narcissist,
yeah,
and psychopath that he is. But does seeing a serial killer or observing a serial killer cause one to become a serial killer? In my experience, no, and I'll tell you why. First of all, you either have that predisposition, which I truly believe in the case of a psychopath is a predisposition toward harming other people and the enjoyment of inflicting pain on someone else. You either have that or you don't have it. And even if you do have it, it has to be triggered in some way. With in the case of BTK, that where how he started was at the age of 10, and he was at his grandmother's farm, and she killed a chicken for dinner. And when he saw the blood squirt out of that chicken's neck, he became sexually aroused, and that's what started his evolution, if you will, and his
yeah,
progression. So those things have to happen. There has to be a trigger. Something has to happen in order for it. But once they're there, once they're already on that progression, on that journey, seeing other serial killers could potentially, yeah, fuel the flames or fan the flames.
yeah. You've mentioned this show, and so want to give you a chance to talk about this media event that you put on. And I think is this the same thing that you have coming up in Chicago?
Yes, well, last year, and thank you so much for bringing it up. Yeah, last year I went around the country, hit about 15 major cities, and I introduced this show, The Psychology of Serial Killers. And what I'm doing now is I'm adapting it. I've learned what the audience really responds to, and so I have a new show, and it's called Why We Love Serial Killers, which is the same title as my book. And we premiere in Chicago on April 11th at a venue there, beautiful venue. It's called the City Winery, which is right downtown on West Randolph Street in Chicago. And it's at 7:30 p.m. So for anyone who might be in Chicago or visiting Chicago at that time, April 11th, please come out to the City Winery. And I promise you an evening filled with thrills and chills about these individuals. And my show is really set up in two acts. Act number one, I try to describe and explain everything that someone might want to know about serial killers and what drives them. But then I also take you inside the mind of several different serial killers who I know extremely well and have stories and inside information that no one else has on the son of Sam, David Berkowitz, Dennis Rader, BTK, and the Long Island serial killer. And then in the second act of the show, we get into the psychology, our own psychology, and our fascination with the dark side and these individuals. But the thing that really seems to be what everyone loves is I spend about 30 minutes in a live Q&A session where people get to ask questions from the audience, anything that they'd like to know about this topic and serial killers. And believe it or not, David, I will get hundreds of questions submitted in that evening. I can't possibly get to them all, but it shows you how much people love this aspect of the show. So I'm really excited to introduce some new things, as well as some of the things that worked so well last year. And we're going to kick it off in Chicago, as I said, on April 11th. And we then plan to roll it out over the summer. So more dates will be announced soon.
Wow. What a creative, inventive thing for you to do. I mean, I certainly I've had a taste of that hunger that you're talking about. One of the things I learned from working on the Zodiac case was, and I don't know if this has happened to you, maybe it will happen, uh, where people would contact me to say, "Oh my God, because the Zodiac had not been, as far as I know, the case still has not been solved, although various people will claim that it has been." But I checked in with my co-author, who I really trust. He's been in true crime for a long time, and he said no, he doesn't buy any of it. But at any rate, I would be contacted by people saying, "Oh my God, my stepfather is the Zodiac. He's exactly what you've described." And this happened over and over again to such an extent, my co-author doesn't even really want to hear from anybody like that. He's heard it all. He's tired of it. But it really shows how a scary number of individuals are out there as parents or uncles or whatever, as family members or family friends who have done really scary stuff. And, that would qualify them, to somebody who knows them well, to think, "Oh my God, this is the guy." Have you
Yes.
run into anything like that?
Oh, absolutely. I get all the time, these tips that, oh, I know who the Zodiac is, or the Boston Strangler. They didn't get the right guy. I went to school with him. All those things. And then, of
Yeah.
course, you get the ones that say, "I'm pretty sure that my brother-in-law is a psychopath and I think he's a serial killer. Can you look into it?"
Yeah,
And I'll say to
right.
people, "I'm sorry, that's not what I do. I'm not a
Yeah.
private investigator. I'm not law enforcement." But yes, absolutely, absolutely, I do get those. I do get those things. And you touch upon a topic that it's one thing, and I love passionate fans, people who are into true crime, and some of them, there are the web sleuths who have actually been instrumental and helpful in solving some cases. You have the people who embed themselves into the investigation through social media and through the internet, and have actually been helpful to law enforcement.
Huh.
But then you've got the people who take it to the extreme. You've got the groupies who fall in love with these individuals, who become obsessed, who are, clearly not doing anything that's pro-social, in nature.
Yeah,
And
these guys get marriage proposals, right? You've pointed that out in your book.
well, in fact, one of the most infamous serial killers of all time, Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, married one of his groupies. He actually married one of his groupies, and
Wow.
and to take it, while he was behind bars, in fact, and on death row, and to take it a step further, there's another phenomenon out there that your audience may be fascinated by, and we could probably spend a whole another episode show talking about, is the collection of what is known as murderabilia. memorabilia, but murderabilia. And that is the artifacts and the personal items and drawings and paintings of legendary killers. There's a huge market for that out there.
Wow.
There are websites dedicated to the sale of this stuff. And believe it or not, Richard Ramirez's widow, because he died in prison a few years ago of liver failure. He was a drug addict and an alcoholic. She actually authenticates his murderabilia. So if you buy a shirt on the internet that Richard Ramirez once wore, you get a letter that says, yes, my husband wore this shirt. She authenticates this stuff and no doubt gets a piece of the action, for selling it. And some of these items sell for thousands of dollars.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness.
Yeah. Oh, Jeffrey Dahmer's eyeglasses. His last known pair of eyeglasses before he was beaten to death in prison, killed by a fellow inmate, has been on auction since last year, asking price $150,000.
My goodness. Huh. This certainly is a psychological phenomenon to
It is
ponder. Yeah.
clearly, clearly, yes.
Yeah. So how will people find you? Like if they want to go to they want to be in touch with you, or uh, they want to find out about this show in Chicago.
Yes,
What's the best way
absolutely.
to do that?
Well, thank you for asking that question, David. And so, two ways. One is you can go to my professional website, which is docbonn.com, DOCBONN.com, and there are links there to my books. There is also a link directly to the City Winery, where you can purchase tickets to the show there in Chicago on April 11th. And if you prefer to go direct and purchase tickets to the show directly, then you can go to citywinery.com/Chicago/events. So City Winery, CITYWINERY.com/Chicago/events. And I'm on Twitter, which is at docbond.com, and I'm on TikTok at realdocbond.com. So those are a number of ways you can reach out and get in touch.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. So be sure to drop me a quick email so I can make sure that I've got them in my show notes too, because I may not have caught it all. I wasn't taking any notes just now. And so the whole concept of serial killer is actually, you would think, okay, well, we can easily define a serial killer. But one of the things you cover in the book is there's been some debate over the years as to, well, how do we decide who's a serial killer?
Yes, yes, and that's why it's hard to get or difficult to get hard and fast numbers. And the same thing happens with mass murderers today. What exactly is a mass murder? Well, it's the same thing with serial killers. The definition of a serial killer that I typically use for general discussion is an individual who has killed at least three people, could be more, where there is a distinction and a separation between each crime scene, because serial killers typically kill people who are not in any way connected, don't know one another, and where there is what is known as an emotional cooling off period in between the murders. Most serial killers had come down from almost like an adrenaline high when they kill.
Yeah,
And they cool off emotionally. They go back into a life that usually seems pretty normal on the outside to the unsuspecting eye, until that itch and that need to kill comes back, and then they kill again. However, just to give you an idea of, that not everyone agrees with this, the FBI some 15 years ago or so decided to lower the number of killings to two. You only need to kill twice in
Hmm.
separate crime scenes and events, and they eliminated the cooling off period in between. And they said the reason for this is, and remember, they're not looking at this from necessarily a psychological standpoint. They're looking at it as a practical matter of apprehension and arrest. That they said it really doesn't matter. Once you've got two in separate crime scenes and events, the cooling off doesn't matter, and we don't really need three. So for their purposes, they've actually widened the net, if you will, to just to bring it to two. So
They're,
it's an
were they not busy enough or what? They're going to be, this is going to keep them very busy.
yeah, you're right. You're right. But however, there is a lot of good news here. And in regards to the proliferation of serial killers, and that is that the numbers are way down from the 1970s and 1980s. I believe, based on the numbers of various sources, there were at least 650 serial killers on the loose in the United States in the 1970s, and that number escalated to more than 800 in the 1980s, which those decades were sort of the heyday, if you will, of serial killers. And then since the 1990s, the numbers have dropped precipitously.
Why
Precipitously.
would that be?
Um, Several fold. I mean, and I've spent a lot of time talking about this, and I talk about it quite a bit in my show. But up until the 1970s, very little was known about serial killers. In fact, they weren't even called serial killers. They were called mass murderers. They were lumped together with the public shooters, mass public shooters, school
Yeah,
shooters today. And the psychology of the two, the psychology of a mass shooter versus the psychology of a serial killer is very, very different.
right.
School shooters tend to be fatalistic individuals that want to go out in one blaze of glory. Serial killers have a hunger and they want to do it again and again and again. It's a different type of individual. So in the early 1970s in Quantico, Virginia, the FBI formed their behavioral science unit. The OG profilers like Hazelwood and others got together. They began to study in earnest. They used the term serial killer for the first time. And as I like to say, when you develop new tools and you're using those tools a lot, guess what? You tend to find a lot of what you're looking for. And so the 70s became the heyday of serial killers. That expanded even into the 1980s. But by the 1980s, we were getting much better at profiling, detecting, and ultimately apprehending these individuals. And of course, then also along came DNA. And DNA was a big game changer. DNA has solved many a cold case. The Golden State Killer that had been a cold case for decades was recently solved with familial ancestry DNA.
Right.
BTK was ultimately solved with DNA, and even Brian Koberger, who's in the news, your audience may be familiar with him. He's been charged with killing 4 students in Idaho. It's one of the big news stories, crime news stories of the last year. I really believe that had he not been apprehended, and I do believe that he is most likely going to be found guilty due to the DNA, that there's an excellent chance that he would have gone on to become a serial killer. I think he was simply caught, a great likelihood that he was caught before he reached serial killer status. So I think we were catching these individuals earlier on. So the good news is the numbers are way down. We're probably talking less than 50 serial killers this decade thus far, maybe a few dozen. So there are not as many of them out there, but they still exist. That hunger, I mean, the thing that causes a serial killer to be a serial killer is not going to go away, but hopefully we get just much better at detecting them and apprehending them before they do a lot of damage.
Yeah, boy. Well, this has been so rich. One thing that I didn't say at the beginning was tempted to say, but decided not to, but now I'm going to say it, is your book is encyclopedic. And the reason I hesitated to say that is that would make it sound, you know, very dry and boring, that is, but your coverage is so authoritative and so broad, from so many angles that it is encyclopedic in the best sense of the word, without it being overly long. The book is what, around 200 or 300 pages?
Less than 300. Yeah, less than 300.
Less, yeah, less than 300. So, um, so is there anything else that we need to get under the get the camel's nose under the tent here before we close the circus down?
Well, I appreciate that, and I appreciate you. I think that um, your interpretation or your assessment of my book is right on the money, and it's actually what I was going for. I was hoping to write a book that would be used in academic circles, and it is. It's used in journalism courses, communication courses, criminology courses at universities. But it's also I try to write it from a very user friendly standpoint so that the average person who just has an interest in this topic would be able to enjoy it and digest it as well. And it seems to have it seems to have worked out pretty well because I do have a dual audience, in that regard. So I appreciate that. And, I would just say that I think it's important. So much of what I say is let's debunk the mysteries or the myths. Let's tell the truth out there. Let's not glorify these individuals. Let's not glamorize them,
Right.
but let's understand that they do somehow fit into the general pop psychology and pop culture. And I think it's important to understand that because it also tells us more about ourselves. And that's really ultimately what I was hoping to do. And what I do hope to do and why I do this show, why I take this show around the country.
Well, I think I wish you good luck, good fortune in your showbiz career now, and your educational career, and we'll have our eye on you. So,
I
so
appreciate that.
Dr. Scott Bonn, I want to thank you for being my guest today on Shrink Rap Radio.
Been my distinct pleasure, and I wish you all a blessed day.